on the disenchantment of the world. This was one of the central themes of much of the work of the great sociologists of the later 19th, early 20th century, in particular Max Weber, and the loss of connection with each other and with the natural world was a great sorrow and cause for investigation. It's also been something that has been central to my own life's work as an anthropologist and historian. And I've recently been thinking about it again, writing a book called Enchantment and Modernity, and writing in various ways about this process. By disenchantment, I mean here the separation off of human beings from the natural world. They start, as I'll try to explain, connected and end up disconnected, and their life is still enchanted, I believe, but in a different way. So this is a very broad brush interpretation of how and when this happened. It's obviously oversimplified, but let's begin with people who lived absolutely involved in nature. They were hunters and gatherers, as anthropologists call them. They hunted animals and they gathered fruit and vegetables and other things from their natural environment. And there was no manipulation of nature. This is a very long period of human existence, most of it, in fact, the Paleolithic, from 500,000 years ago up to about 60,000, 70,000 years ago. So most of our time has been involved with nature, enchanted, no separation. And the hunters and gatherers, whether in Australia or in Africa or in Canada or elsewhere, lived without any kind of separation from their natural world. Then, about 50,000, 60,000 years ago, human beings began to dominate their world, their natural world, a little bit. The Neolithic Revolution, the harnessing of nature by way of agriculture, of two main forms, growing crops and herding and domesticating animals. And here now you already begin to have human beings in a symbiotic but more distant relationship to the natural world. And this is the great period when a phenomenon called shamanism was very widespread. And in shamanism, most people, most of the time, get on with their lives, and they don't have direct access to the natural spirits that are around them and the natural world in the same way as before. And so you get a kind of beginnings of institutionalization of experts who, through their secret and deep knowledge and their choosing as experts, mediate between the populace and the spiritual world of entities out there in the natural world. And these shamans go into possession or hear voices or whatever. And I experienced this in the Himalayas, which has a strong shamanic tradition. That continues until about 10,000, 15,000 years ago, when you get the next great phase, which is often called civilizations or peasantries. And here human beings have moved beyond simple agricultural domination to a domination based on many new techniques and technologies, particularly writing, the growth of cities, new crafts, new governmental organizations, new educational systems, and from Egypt and then and China and Mesopotamia onwards, you have the great phase of civilizations and peasant civilizations. Now you're even more distant if you're a city dweller in one of the ancient great cities, you're very cut off from the natural world, and you're cut off by the technologies of writing, and you have often a priest class who go through the rituals. They don't do it so much through shamanic means, but they have writings, they have religions of the book, as they're called. And during that phase, man is more and more disconnected. But one interesting thing about that particular thing is that at this point, the world splits roughly east-west. In the West, that is as far as the Middle East, you have the rise soon or later of the monotheistic Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And these make the split, the disenchantment, even greater. God created the world. He made human beings masters of that world, and we are separated off from that world. The priests have access to God, but you get a great division. And this is what the philosopher Jaspers calls the axial age, or part of it is the axial age of the separation of the supernatural world above us and the natural world which human beings inhabit. And the world becomes a world of matter, and the spirits disappear upwards and away. And that is the world that led into the modern world I was educated into. But to the east, from India onwards, you don't get the dominance on the whole of those monotheistic religions. You get obviously penetration of Islam and other things, but on the whole, and particularly further east you go to China and Japan, you don't get that separation. And indeed, I think the axial age withers out as you get into the Far East and China onwards. So there you have enchantment remaining, the muted enchantment of the peasant civilizations remains, and I think, rather counterintuitively, it remains to this day, and that Japan, and to a large extent China, and some of Southeast Asia are still enchanted worlds. And this is what Weber himself thought. He described China as an enchanted garden, and I think it probably still is. Anyway, that was the next phase, and then you get the twin huge breaks in the West alone of the scientific revolution, where science begins even more to make man dominant. The world becomes a clockwork universe, famously in the work of Newton and others, and the domination of human beings over their natural environment is almost complete. Alongside that, they use part of that and their increased knowledge to manipulate the world through the application of science, through technology, and you have the Industrial Revolution, the growth of urban civilizations, and you get what many people think of as modernity. And there, all that enchantment has faded. It's still there in childhoods of people like Wordsworth, but as you grew up, you became rational and disenchanted human beings living in this secular world. It's not as simple as that, of course, and I've argued in my book on enchantment that we in the West still create individualistic enchantment, pockets of enchantment all through our days and lives. We enter little worlds which we become absorbed in, and they are in a way enchanted through music and love and so on. But on the whole, the civilization is disenchanted. So we have moved in this direction. But what is happening now, and is very fascinating, is in some ways the re-enchantment of the world. All sorts of developments in theory, in quantum theory, developments in the influence of Eastern thought and Buddhism and Chinese metaphysics and so on, all this leads into a world which is not as it was when I grew up. It feels more enchanted in some ways. And so there is a tension, a growing away, and the ecological movements in particular, and our realization of our embeddedness in nature and the natural world, and our realization that we know so little about how our world and our universe works. That all leads to, I hope, more humility, involvement, and a form of meaningful reconnection.